Welcome to Mindset Positivo, the podcast where we explore the depths of the human mind and uncover pathways to a more balanced and empowered life. I am Pedro Belo, your host, and today we have the honor to welcoming one of the world's most renowned neuroscientists. Our guest is Dr. Joseph LeDoux, director of the Emotional Brain Institute at the New York University. He's also a professor of neuroscience and psychology at NIU, as well as a professor of psychiatry and child and adolescent psychiatry at NIU Langen. With decades of pioneering research, Dr. LeDoux is an authority on the study of emotions, particularly in relation to fear and anxiety. Throughout his career, Dr. LeDoux has been uncovering the mysteries of the emotional brain, influencing not only neuroscience but also clinical practices and therapeutic approaches worldwide. His books and studies have been fundamental in helping us understand how our emotions shape our behavior and perception of the world. Dr. Joseph LeDoux, it's a privilege to have you with us. Welcome to Mindset Positivo. It's an honor to
Thank you
have
very
you
much
here
for
with
having
us
me.
today. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. Your research on human emotions, especially fear and anxiety, has been groundbreaking. To start, could you share a bit about what led you to focus on the study of fear and emotions?
Um, I have a very complicated background. I had 2 degrees in business administration, marketing, and business. And I was I didn't find it very interesting. This was like the late '60s, and it was not very cool to be involved in business or marketing at that time. So I got very interested in psychology. So I was taking a lot of psychology courses as part of my marketing degree. And just happened to take a course called Learning and Motivation, which I thought was about human behavior, but it turned out it was about a professor studying rats and memory in the brain. And I thought that was fascinating. I didn't know you could study the brain and make a living out of that. So I took his class. I fell in love with it, and I said, "Okay, I want." At the end of the class, I said, "I want to go to graduate school to do this." He said, "You're crazy. You have no background." But I said, "That's all right. I'll try it." So I sent a bunch of letters of requests to enter graduate school out, and all rejected me except one, where the professor that I was working with knew someone. So then he got me in, and then I ended up studying split brain patients for the next 4 years. These are people in whom the two hemispheres are separated to control intractable epilepsy. And it was a fascinating thing because it was, if you put information into the right hemisphere of a patient with a split brain, because language is typically in the left hemisphere can't talk about what the right hemisphere saw. Can only talk about what the left hemisphere saw. But the right hemisphere, even though it can't talk, can reach into a bag, and let's say you showed a picture of an apple to the right hemisphere, it can pull the apple out of the bag and ignore the banana and the orange. So there is something going on in the right hemisphere. It just wasn't clear exactly what it was. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we went on to study one patient in whom he could read on both sides of the brain, but he could only talk out of the left. So this was a new opportunity to ask how much consciousness is in the right hemisphere, because we had the ability to probe it verbally. So we would put questions in the right hemisphere like, "Who are you?" And then the left hand would reach out and arrange letters like Scrabble letters, the game Scrabble, where it's A, B, C, D. So the left hand reached out and picked up Paul, which was what the name of the boy was. And that's the name that the left hemisphere knew, but it also was the name the right hemisphere knew. And we asked it what he wanted to be when he grew up. And the right hemisphere said he wanted to be a race car driver, and the left hemisphere wanted to be an architect. So it was kind of fascinating that you could have almost two minds in the same head, one conscious of wanting to be an architect and one conscious of wanting to be a race car driver. So that was
Amazing.
how I got started. And we did one small study on emotion in those patients. Uh, and from there, I got interested in the topic of emotion. And my professor, Mike Gazzaniga, who is my PhD advisor, told me once, he said, there's not much research on emotion in neuroscience these days. Emotion used to be a very big topic in brain research in the late 19th century and on into the 20th century. But in psychology, it was the study of the brain was kind of behind schedule in a way, and there was a lot of research on emotion in social psychology in the 60s and 70s, but in neuroscience, it was almost taboo to be studying emotion because neuroscience was a brand new field in the late 1960s, early 70s, and it was trying to be as scientifically rigorous or proper as it could be. And emotion just seemed like it was too amorphous, too, I don't know, too spiritual in a sense. I'm not sure if
too
that was like
abstract.
too abstract and not not a hard enough science, right? The
Okay.
neuroscience was trying to be a very hard science, and the emotion was thought to be too soft. So it was not something that you would do as a neuroscientist. And I applied for a grant to study rats and emotional behavior at one point, but the grant was rejected because neuroscientists don't study emotion. That was the rejection letter. So, but I was young and naive and said, well, I'll change the title a little bit so it was less about emotion. And I was able to receive the grant at that point. And I basically disguised myself as a Pavlovian conditioning researcher for many years, studying emotional behavior and Pavlovian conditioning, all
Mhm.
the while always wanting to go back to consciousness. So I would occasionally write a book chapter or something, and I would talk about emotional consciousness. But in all of my empirical work, I would talk about emotional behavior, which is okay. It was okay to talk about emotional behavior, but not emotional consciousness in neuroscience. So it was a crazy time. I remember one of my colleagues who was from everyone who was doing animal behavior at that time was from the behaviorist background. And so one of these behaviorist colleagues says, "Why are you always talking about emotional behavior? It's just behavior." And I kept pushing the idea of emotion slowly, and eventually it kind of came around, and more and more people got to do it. And the same colleague who said, why are you talking about emotion, started talking about emotional conditioning, emotional learning.
Mhm.
So, it kind of took off after a while, not just because of me. I mean, I think my book, The Emotional Brain, had a big impact. Um, and so did Antonio Damasio's Descartes' Error. The Descartes' Error came out a little bit before The Emotional Brain. Uh, and in between my book and Damasio's book, or maybe a little after, I'm not sure. But Daniel Goleman had a book called Emotional Intelligence. Now, many people think of that, that was a pop psychology kind of book. And it was, but he did a very, very rigorous analysis of my work and Damasio's work and
Mhm.
some other work to try and create a scientific foundation for emotional intelligence. So it was a very important way for at least getting my work out to the public. And from there, kind of things took off. I wrote other books, The Synaptic Self, a couple of years later. And then I didn't write a book until 2015. I wrote Anxious, and then The
Mhm.
Deep History of Ourselves, and most recently, The Four Realms of Existence. So um, each of those books became more and more and more about consciousness, which has been my love ever since that first time I saw a split brain patient.
Thank you very much. And that's amazing. And that takes me to another question that I had almost for the list. And the question it is um, from a neuroscientific perspective, Dr. LeDoux, how is it possible for us then to have self awareness and the capacity to observe and analyze ourselves? What mechanisms in the brain enable this complex metacognitive process? In other words, what is the nature of self? Maybe this influence our understanding of what it means to be a human.
Yes. Well, self is a very complicated topic. This is one of those ideas that goes back to ancient Greece, and the oracle Delphi said, "Know thyself," and that was a kind of popular thing that has been passed down over the generations. And we developed all kinds of ideas about self, almost to the extent, and I think maybe even actually to the extent that sometimes scientists talk about the self as if it is almost a separate thing inside of
Mm-hmm.
us. And I think that's wrong. Self is a story that we understand about ourselves. It's not another thing, another kind of entity inside of us that's making decisions for us. There's nothing more to the self than there is to you. It's just a name we give for a certain aspect of ourselves that we narrate to ourselves. And that's one of the key things I got out of my split brain work was how
Mm-hmm.
the conscious mind has evolved a way to generate stories, to generate narratives, to make our behavior make sense. So, for example, we had the same patient that I was telling you about earlier. We did this one experiment that was changed both the way that certainly changed the way I was thinking about all these things, but also the way my mentor, Mike Gazzaniga, was thinking about it. So what we did was we put a picture in the left side of a screen, picture on the left side of a screen, which means it goes to the right hemisphere, of
Mm-hmm.
a snow scene. So there's a car and it's covered in snow. On the right side of the screen, there's a picture of a chicken. And then the two hands, the left hand points to a shovel because the right hemisphere saw a snow scene, and the right hand points to a chicken. And so you said, why did you do that? And so I'm sorry, did I get that wrong? Okay,
It
that's fine.
crosses. It crosses
So
right to the.
the left hemisphere responds now. It's going to tell us why it performed those two behaviors. It said, well, I saw a chicken claw, so I pointed to the chicken. So that's what the left hemisphere saw. And you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. This is the left hemisphere responding to the fact that the left hand's pointing to a shovel. The
Mhm.
left hand pointed to a shovel because the right hemisphere saw a snow scene. But the left hemisphere generated a story to make the shovel and the chicken go together. So he generated a narrative that explains his behavior. And the light bulb went off in us. It's like this is not some kind of weird thing that happens in brain surgery or anything. This is what we do every day of our life. We generate stories to
Understand.
explain to ourselves why we're doing what to explain to ourselves and others. And so that the self is one of those stories that we are constantly explaining. It's like um, if you look at all of the philosophers in contemporary times and neuroscientists and psychologists who talk about the self, what they mean by self is all over the place. But the concept, I think the constant across all of those interpretations is self is a story.
Mm-hmm.
Yourself is a story you tell to yourself and to others to make your life make sense.
Like a biography, a self-biography.
Autobiography.
Uh,
But it's a changing autobiography. Every moment of the day, who you are
okay.
changes because you are constantly interpreting and reinterpreting and reinterpreting who you are, depending on what you are remembering at the moment and what influences you have
Yes,
from
what you
other things.
observe, the conditionings, the beliefs. Yeah,
Yes.
it's all about that. And what amazing insight. And we know emotions play a crucial role in survival and decision making. When we encounter danger, the amygdala is activated automatically. Yet many of us continue to experience anxiety or fear in safe everyday situations. What is the origin of this, and is it possible to reprogram this response, do you think?
Okay, I think that's a question we need to break down into two parts. The first part is about the amygdala, and I spent many
Mm-hmm.
years studying the amygdala. We called it fear conditioning. Um, that's what the field called it, so that's what I called it.
Mm-hmm.
But I also introduced the idea of what the amygdala does is implicit fear, because explicit fear means conscious fear. And I had come to think of consciousness from the split brain patients as a kind of cortical cognitive process. So when I said that I was talking about the amygdala and fear, what I was talking about was not the a little kind of feeling of fear bubbling up in the amygdala, causing you to behave, as many think, that the amygdala is a quote fear center, that the amygdala makes the feeling of fear, and that's what causes you to behave. But that's not how I think about it. Certainly, I was confused a bit in the early days because I was just getting involved in the field, and I didn't make too much noise about it. But the longer I was in the field, the more I began to get concerned about what we were talking about. And I could see that there was so much confusion because half of the field would be talking about fear as a conscious emotional experience, that feeling of fear. But the other half, which I was working with, all the behaviorists, the behavioral psychologists studying the brain, thought of fear not as a conscious experience, but as a kind of connection between a stimulus and a response. So you had people like Jaak Panksepp, who were not in the behaviorist tradition at all, and he talked about the amygdala as being the seat of fear. But you have the behaviorists talking about fear as not being a conscious experience at all. It's just simply a connection, physiological state that mediates between the stimulus and the response, and not a conscious state, just a kind of brain state. So the field was very confused because everybody would just use the word fear. But unless you knew, for all the behaviors, they said, well, it doesn't matter because all that matters is that we understand what we're talking about when we talk to each other. But when something becomes so public as the amygdala, and it becomes a meme that everyone in the culture knows about now, the amygdala is not something that's just talked about in scientific circles. It's in comic strips, it's in movies, it's in radio shows, it's all over the place. And so once that meme goes out into the culture, you have to define what you're talking about because the culture is thinking about the common sense meaning of the word, the experience of fear. But the behaviorists didn't think we needed to deal with that because nobody believes in this ghostly kind of experience that we have, these emotions, these like conscious feelings. But so I was kind of stuck because on the one hand, I was a behaviorist in terms of what the amygdala did, but I was a pure cognitivist in terms of what emotion was. So emotion for me is a conscious or cognitive interpretation of a situation in which you find yourself. This goes back to the social psychologist who invented the idea of what am I trying to say? Of cognitive dissonance, Leon Festinger, in the 1950s. And so you have these dissonant states of the brain, and these dissonant states are what is causing us to generate these narratives. So in the split brain patient pointing to the shovel, he was pointing to the shovel to reduce the dissonance of not knowing why he was pointing to the shovel. So this became a very fundamental aspect of my research. Actually, my master's thesis in marketing was also on cognitive dissonance, post-purchase cognitive dissonance. And it was just a total coincidence that at the end of my graduate career, I was talking about cognitive dissonance, not about from the marketing thing, but because of the dissonance reducing explanations that the the left hemisphere was doing of the right hemisphere behavior. So yeah, so I think of emotions. I'll put it into words for you. An emotion is a cognitive interpretation of a psychological or a neurological kind of situation that you find yourself in, and it's an interpretation that's grounded in your memories about who you are, your memories about what emotions are. We often hear that emotions are like fear are universal around the world, but that's not true. What's universal is the idea of danger. Every culture has a word for danger, and you can translate the word fear across all those cultures. And so it's assumed because you can translate the word fear across cultures, everyone must feel the same thing. But we know, you probably recognize differences in your culture and American culture. Certainly, Asian cultures or cultures of Western indigenous people, those have different perspectives on what all these emotions are. But when we use the same words, when we translate the same word into something as if it were referring to the same kind of experience, I think we're doing an injustice to what an emotion is. It's a culturally defined experience. So
Mhm.
we each learn from our own lives what is danger and what fear is. But that that learning is contextualized by the culture in which that learning took place. So, let's say if I'm sitting here with an American who grew up in Louisiana, which is where I grew up, we might have very similar kinds of ideas about what fear is.
Mhm.
Um, but maybe if you go, and people growing up in New York would also have slightly different ideas. Um, but everyone in general has a different idea because each one of us learns what fear is. So you could say, in a sense, fear is individualistic. Every emotion
Okay.
is individualistic. It's based on what the person has learned about that kind of situation. And it's also it's different because you're in a different culture than I am. So I have a different kind of emotion from everyone else that grew up with me. And I have a different kind of culture. I'm sorry, different kind of emotion from everyone in every other culture that's ever grown up like
Mhm.
that. It's just how life is. We learn about what we are exposed to very young.
Amazing. Thank you very much. You also studied the role of the prefrontal cortex, which helps to regulate those responses. How can the prefrontal cortex be trained to strengthen our capacity to face fears or reduce anxiety?
Okay, so given if we go back to the idea that emotions are narratives,
Mhm.
that narratives we have that we generate because in a situation of danger, you have acquired over the course of your life schema, which are bodies of knowledge about danger. In this case, in a dangerous situation, the schema for danger is activated. And that schema then becomes a template from which your conscious experience will evolve as the situation unfolds. So, what is evolving from that is a narration of the situation which you find yourself, which is based on everything you've learned about fear and danger. So, if fear is a narration and it is you're having a problem with fear and anxiety, the answer is not to take a pill that is going to solve the problem because
Mhm.
it it's I think the medications are useful, but at a basic level. They're not useful for changing the subjective content of the mental state of fear or anxiety. What they're useful for is reducing physiological arousal and changing reflexive, reactive behaviors that might be responsive to the medications. So you might be able to turn down the volume of the amygdala with the medication and also turn down the volume of the physiological responses controlled by the amygdala.
Mhm.
But that's not going to solve the problem of your experience of fear. And for that, what you have to do, because your conscious experience of fear is a narration, you have to re narrate what it is that you are experiencing. So we can think of a kind of three-step program. One, you might want to tame the amygdala. Now, what I mean by taming the amygdala is let's say you go into a restaurant in New York. Have you been to New York before?
Never.
So you go to a
One
restaurant in
day.
New York, probably wherever you live, you go to a restaurant and the music is too loud. So because restaurants like to have music playing loud and people drinking and having a good time.
Yeah.
So you go into the restaurant, it's too loud, and someone my age will maybe ask the waiter to turn it down because I can't enjoy the meal if it's too loud and noisy. And let's say it's some music I don't like heavy metal that's playing on so that the waiter kindly turns the volume down. It's the same heavy metal song that I don't like, but it's less irritating, less disturbing to me.
You
I'm
can
not
better
as
auto-regulate.
yeah, and so but the same is true with these medications. I think they turn down the volume, and now with the volume down, You can now go to step two, which is to tame the hippocampus. You've tamed the amygdala by turning down the volume. So now you can consider your memories and the hippocampal role in memory. And I use these words amygdala and hippocampus as metaphors, really. I'm not just saying the amygdala does it all or the hippocampus does it all. You know, it's like they are metaphors for what's important. You have to change your memory. And once you change your memory, then you can do step three, which is tame your prefrontal cortex. There, you want to re-narrate your memories and your understanding of these behavioral and physiological responses, and think of yourself not as someone who has been labeled as an anxious person, or if you have a label, then you become what the label is because you've now re-narrated who you are based on that label. Psychiatrist gives you a label. You're an anxious person. You now are thinking of yourself as an anxious person. So you've got to get rid of those narrations that you have. And that, I think, can only be done through, again, prefrontal is also a kind of metaphor. I mean, it's not just prefrontal cortex, but a lot of areas. But prefrontal, I think, is important.
Very well. So, with that context, Dr. LeDoux, in your view, you think medications prescribed for anxiety or fear don't truly address the root causes of the emotions, right?
That's correct. So how
Okay.
how is it possible you could swallow a pill,
Yeah, I
goes
understand.
into
Yeah,
your
very,
digestion?
very interesting. So, you believe these treatments are based on what we know about the emotional brain circuits. I mean, they are not truly effective. It's not only to swallow a pill and the emotion goes away. As you said, it turns down the volume. Um, in your book, Anxious,
Right.
you
I just want to respond to
sorry,
something.
it's your
I want to
turn.
respond to something
Sorry.
you said. I don't think the circuits you're talking about are emotional circuits.
Okay.
Emotion is the cognitive part. The survival
Okay.
component is what the amygdala has. It has that ancient survival capacity, which not only is something that's true in humans, but through every living thing that has ever lived has had to be able to detect and respond to danger, from the earliest bacterial cell all the way to us.
Thank you very much. Fascinating insights, Dr. LeDoux. Um, as I was asking, in your book, Anxious, you discuss the role of consciousness in emotional regulation and how important is it to be conscious and present in managing negative emotions. And anxiety is on the rise among both young people and adults. Do you believe that modern society contributes to higher levels of anxiety or fear?
Yes, I mean, the there was a poem written in the late mid 20th century by Auden called the Age of Anxiety. And ever since that term was coined, every generation has thought that it was the most anxious age. But I think we have outdone ourselves now. That with the digital world that we exist in, the political world we exist in, it's all coming together to challenge our well-being in a sense. There's so much going on right now. So I do think maybe we are at this point the most anxious generation that ever existed.
True. I agree from my perspective. You often talk about emotions shape decision making. Do you think we are actually in control of our decisions, or our actions primarily driven by emotions and the brain's automatic defense systems?
Both.
Okay.
I believe in free will, and I know
Okay.
it's being challenged by a lot of scientists and philosophers now. Um, but I think we shouldn't think of this in terms of night and day, right?
Mhm.
Free will or not free will. We have the degrees of how accountable we are for our behaviors, and some behaviors we um, not don't necessarily have conscious control of. For example, you see a snake, you're going to freeze. You see someone coming at you with a knife or something, you're going to freeze. Those are automatic responses.
Mm.
Now, there's another level, though, of cognitive decision making that takes place, not necessarily conscious, but cognitive, where we make, we achieve goal directed behaviors because we've acquired, ways that we interpret stimuli and what we should do in those situations. But then on the other hand, we can also make goal-directed decisions consciously, I think, but not necessarily all the time. It's like, I think the 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 brain is, the more the brain calls on consciousness, the more energy it uses. Consciousness is a very energy demanding kind of neural activity. So if we can make decisions based on past cognitive learning, past goal directed learning, then we don't have to use as much energy. And if we can make decisions on the basis of our reflexive behaviors that we have acquired or that are innate, that is another level at which metabolism is not engaged to the highest level. So as we go from automatic reactions to goal-directed actions to consciously controlled actions, we use more and more energy. So it's not very useful to always be conscious in choosing what to do. So that's what I mean by this kind of gradation of volition, of goal-directed, conscious goal-directed behavior.
Understand. There's a lot to unpack here. Dr. LeDoux, what do you think if we could precisely control fear and emotional responses in the brain? Do you think we might lose something essential to the human experience? Could our efforts to perfect emotional control actually meet our capacity for resilience, growth, empathy, for example? Do you think?
Well, that I'm sure you're aware of the inverted U curve for fear and anxiety, so that if you're going up the curve, you're getting more and more anxious, right? So you need a little bit of anxiety to achieve anything in life, right? If you don't care, if you're not anxious a little bit, if it's not meaningful to you, then you're not going to work at it. So you have to use that bit of anxiety to get you through the good parts and the bad parts of life. But once you get to the top of the curve and start going back down the other side, you've now gotten to the point where anxiety is no longer helpful but harmful. And the trick is not to have, to eliminate fear or anxiety, but to have the right balance. And that is what we should choose to try to obtain.
Thank you. Your answer really sheds light on this topic. Many of your discoveries have applications in mental health. How can new neuroscience-based therapies help treat emotional and anxiety disorders more effectively? And maybe influence practices like meditation or any other emotional regulation techniques?
Well, I think from time to time, neuroscience has become more and more popular over the years, right? So there was a time I remember in the 1980s when the educators in the United States were seeking brain-based education, right? It was such a fad that everybody wanted to have an understanding of what happens at what age and how can we target the age with the right kind of learning capacity. I think that's it's an important goal, but at that time, and maybe even today still, I don't think we're quite ready to just turn it all over to the brain. The most important thing is understanding the psychology, because that's what we want to change, right? And if we put too much of the weight on the brain without understanding all of the ways the brain influences our psychology, we're getting ahead of the game. So we have to keep psychology in mind and not simply turn to the brain.
Thank you. Maybe a more personal question now. In your career, what has surprised you the most about the complexity of the human brain? Was there a discovery that made you see the brain or the human being from a new perspective?
Well, I think nothing has surprised me or enlightened me more than that split brain patient I told you about from 1978. That has been the enlightenment of that started my career and is what has driven everything I've done ever since. Even when I was masquerading as a Pavlovian conditioning researcher, it was always trying to understand consciousness at some level.
And what an enlightenment. Dr. LeDoux, emotional neuroscience is constantly evolving. What breakthroughs or changes do you foresee in the next 10 years that could transform how we deal with emotions like fear and anxiety?
Well, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but I hope we find a better way to contextualize neuroscience properly, kind of like as what I was saying about education, that we get too far ahead of the game in terms of what the brain can tell us. And the brain is important, but it's not as important. I mean, how should I say it? If we don't know what we're looking for, we can't find it in the brain,
Mhm.
right? So the better our understanding of the psychology of any kind of phenomena, the more likely we'll have an accurate understanding of what the brain does. And then we can use that knowledge about the brain to help understand psychology. But if we misconceptualize psychology before we start studying the brain, we go down all these paths. Like since the 1960s, researchers have been trying to find that magic bullet that will be the medication that makes fear and anxiety go away. But nothing new has been discovered in all those years. It's just, they keep doing it, keep searching, keep searching. We're close, we're so close. The next experiment is going to do it. So the animal studies, they work. Then you give it to a human and it doesn't work because there's no way you're going to change mental states of people by putting a rat or a mouse through some behavioral test in a pharmaceutical company. That rat's behavior may change, but that doesn't mean that that is going to change the conscious feeling of fear and anxiety in a person. And that is the fundamental problem that we understood through animal behavior, when in fact, what we need to be understanding is what fear and anxiety are in the human brain, and then retrofit that back to see what we can and can't study in animals, because I don't think we can study conscious emotions in animals. It's not that they don't have, rat fear or mouse fear or
Mhm.
anything else, but it's not what we have. Our brain is much more complex, and we just have to accept that we're not going to solve the problem of consciousness in a rat. I mean, we may learn some things about animal behavior. For example, I wrote a paper called What Emotions Might Be Like in Other Animals in Current Biology a couple of years ago. And what I proposed was that if we knew what how consciousness comes about in the human brain, let's say, I'm a fan of what Mdal has called three kinds of consciousness: autonoetic consciousness, which is self-awareness; noetic consciousness, which is awareness of facts about life; and anoetic consciousness, which is a kind of more fringe of consciousness state. So Tulving's three kinds of consciousnesses are associated with three kinds of memory, two of which Tulving kind of invented as well: semantic memory, noetic consciousness, and episodic memory, autonoetic consciousness. Whereas a anoetic consciousness is associated with procedural memory. So let's say we understood those three kinds of consciousness in the human brain very clearly, and the brain mechanisms involved. We could then say, well, which animals have those kinds of consciousness? And just for the sake of argument, say that the the kind of consciousness that is continuous throughout all of mammals, anoetic consciousness, um, if that is located or and is dependent upon the medial prefrontal cortex, then the other mammals may have that kind of consciousness, because all mammals share the medial prefrontal cortex. All of the medial areas of cortex are shared by all mammals. Now, but what about primates? Well, we know that working memory is very important for consciousness, for holding information in mind, making it consciousness. Now, in humans, we know that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is very important for working memory.
Mhm.
Monkeys and other primates have very similar kinds of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that we do. So if that is important for human consciousness, human noetic consciousness, semantic consciousness, then other primates may have that noetic semantic consciousness. It would not be semantic in the verbal sense, obviously, it'd be nonverbal semantic consciousness. So it would be different from human semantic consciousness, which includes verbal consciousness. And then finally, if the self is important and the anterior prefrontal cortex, an area called the um, um, what's it called? What there's an area, but I forget what the area BA10, which is in the very front part of the human cortex, is a kind of cortex that is only present in the human brain. So let's say that that area of cortex is what is responsible for our self-awareness. I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying as an example.
Yes.
Then that would explain why many philosophers and scientists think of self-awareness as something that is fairly unique to the humans or perhaps other great apes. So that would using the brain to retrofit what kinds of consciousness we might share with other animals, I think is a way to go that gives you an empirical basis rather than just a kind of armchair speculation about which animals are conscious in the way we are and so forth.
Very well, very well. Thank you. Given your extensive research on the amygdala's role in processing fear, could a person with damage to their amygdala still experience fear? If so, what mechanisms in the brain might allow for this experience despite this possible injury?
Well, as I've been saying since we started talking, the
Yes, yes.
amygdala is not the source of fear. And there are people who have amygdala damage that can still experience fear. So I think we need to rethink what the amygdala does. The amygdala is involved in detecting and responding to danger. Fear is a cognitive construction involving prefrontal cortex. So it's not surprising that a person that has amygdala damage can still feel fear.
Amygdala operates below the radar of our conscious awareness, right?
Now these are my opinions, by the way. I'm not saying this is the answer.
Okay,
I just want to be honest that
sure,
this is my opinion.
And thank you very much, Dr. LeDoux. Thank you so much for sharing your time and insights with us. Your research is truly inspiring, and I know our listeners will walk away from this conversation with fresh perspectives and tools for dealing with their emotions. Before we wrap up, is there any book, study, or practice you'd like to recommend for those who want to dive deeper into understanding the brain and emotions?
Well, I think my most recent book, "The Four Realms of Existence," the subtitle is a new framework for understanding what it means to be human. Is a culmination of all my years of research. It kind of puts everything that I've learned and into a perspective that if someone wants to know what I think about things, they can certainly go there. There are lots of people involved in the field, so I won't say that mine is the only opinion, but if you want to know about my opinion, check that out.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you once again, Dr. LeDoux. It's been a real privilege. And for our listeners, I hope this interview has inspired you to look inward, learn more about how your emotions work, and above all, cultivate a positive mindset. Thank you very much, Dr. LeDoux.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Okay. Thank you a lot. By the way, where can I hear your band? You still have the band, the Amygdaloids?
Amygdaloid's YouTube channel.
Okay, I searched, and the Wikipedia said you had that band. I see the guitar over there.
Yeah. We play the band has not played much in the last few years, but some of us play together. I travel a lot in my work, and often one of the band members will come with me and we'll play some music together.
Very nice.
Where are you located?
Portugal, interior of Portugal.
What town?
Fundão. It's hard for
So
you
I
to
was I
say
was
fundão. The
I was
accent
just
is strange.
in Porto very
Porto.
recently.
Ah, very nice, north of Portugal. Yeah.
Yeah, I received an honorary degree there
Ah, nice.
in last month.
Very good, very
So
good. Did you visit anything else here?
one of my colleagues from London flew there, and we sang some music there too.
Ah, awesome. I used to have a band too. That's why I'm
Oh,
asking.
okay.
I was vocal,
Uh-huh.
rock metal band.
Nice. Okay, so sorry about the medal.
Okay, Dr. Lulu,
All right, so
thank you
thank
very
you for
much
having
for your
me.
time.
Okay. All
Okay,
right.
thank
No,
you a lot.
enjoyed talking. Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Thank you a lot. Thank you. Goodbye.